What's better than a city built on the bottom of the ocean? How about a city seamlessly floating in the sky? In a previous episode, I talked about the city of Rapture that exists within the BioShock video game series. It's a brilliant portrayed city made as believable as possible even through its crazy science fiction origins. The notes and details that went into every hallway, business, and character are astonishingly real. The first two BioShock games were set within the deeply depressurized walls of Rapture, and this game franchise is uniquely horror, survival, claustrophobic, dark, grimy, and wet. It just has like this wet, dark, underwater feel. And when it was announced that a third game was coming, fans were very excited to go back to Rapture, even though the first two games had explored it pretty well. But when the third game came out, and the trailers and everything before it came out in 2013, it was actually not set in Rapture. Instead, it was set in an entirely different time as well, in an entirely different city. So the story behind that city, it's named Columbia. In 1893, a floating city named Columbia was showcased at the year's Chicago World Fair, and it was an immensely popular attraction, and its creator, Zachary Comstock, had much greater plans for it than just an exhibit at the World's Fair. He continued to improve upon it after the World's Fair, and he even made it a real livable city where many people wished to move to because of how it seemed like some kind of Eden. And many people did, but Zachary Comstock had to approve them beforehand. And the reason is because Zachary Comstock thought of himself as a kind of prophet. Comstock made Columbia as a safe haven for mainly wealthy white families looking to escape the foreign hordes. Columbia's ability to float allowed Comstock to relocate the city off the coast of Maine, and then he seceded from the United States in 1902 completely. Comstock had already been in hot water with the U.S. government after involving themselves in such affairs as the Boxer Rebellion in China without the U.S. government's consent. Columbia hosted technology and firepower never before seen and had completely destroyed the city of Peking. Columbia's technology wasn't just in warfare, though. Their advanced technology was also the reason the city was able to float. Instead of using giant balloons or Zeppelin technology, you might think, instead they used something called quantum levitation, which was a design discovered and made usable by two twin quantum physicists hired by Comstock. And the technology does not stop there. Columbia boasts attractions such as automatons, a magnetized rail system, electrically powered mechanical horses, and cyborg-inspired handymen. Many of the designs of the city and its technology are heavily steampunk-inspired as well. There are also vigors, which are drinkable tonics that alter the genetics of the consumer, just like the plasmids in Rapture, but in Rapture they were injectable. And they also give the consumers various handy or violent powers. The city also has a strong religious presence. They worship the founding fathers and Comstock himself, who sees himself as one of the founding fathers. And Comstock's wife also has a religious following known as the Order of the Ravens. And because of the city's inherent racist and violent and high society views, there is an underbelly of slums inhabited by minorities such as African Americans, Irish, and Chinese. These individuals were brought to the city as a workforce, but they quickly developed a not-so-hidden rebellion force known as the Vox Populi to try and fight and combat Comstock and his people. The surface of Columbia seems very bright and beautiful, and it is in the game. You know, that's what it's known for, is just being high in the sky, always sunny above the clouds, and just bright. The colors are bright and shiny. It's close to the sun in the heavens, and as Comstock puts it, it's floating above the Sodom below. But the internal conflicts of the city are ready to erupt once the player comes in the game and he arrives at the city. But I'll let you discover that part on your own. And if you decide to play this masterpiece, which is my personal favorite video game of all time, you'll also learn how it connects with Rapture and the first 2 games in the series. If your idea of anime is all fast-paced, over-dramatized magic and fighting with monologues, then you would be mostly correct, but not at all true for one of the best anime to ever exist, in my opinion. Mushishi. I'm kidding, of course, kind of. A lot of popular anime is very much like that, and there are some good ones in that type of genre. But I'm here to share with you an extremely special and unique anime. One that puts more thoughts in your mind than strain in your eyes. It's called Mushishi. It started as a manga, as most do, which is a Japanese version of a comic book, basically. And it started back in 1999 and had a few different runs and reprints over the next 2 decades. And then the anime came out in 2005, and it had a follow-up season in 2010. 10 years later. It follows the protagonist Ginkgo, whose age is unspecified, but he's somewhere between like mid-20s to early 30s. And he is a man that just travels around Japan. The time period is also unspecified, but it's thought to be maybe like the early 1900s in Japan. Hints can be found based on certain aspects of the story, but the timeline isn't really meant to be that important anyways. What's most important is Ginkgo's profession. He is a mushishi, or mushi master. He travels around rural Japan studying, interacting with, and assisting other people with mushi. Mushi are a separate kind of life form from animals, insects, fish, and even plants and fungi. They are described as life in its purest form. Not all humans can actually see mushi, and in fact, most cannot. There are many different kinds that coexist with humans and other forms of life, and can sometimes affect them in strange or seemingly unexplainable ways. Ginkgo has the ability to see mushi, and he travels and often helps people that are struggling with troublesome mushi in some way. Some mushi are able to control aspects of physics or nature that are impossible to conceive without being aware of their presence. Sometimes mushi are able to explain some natural phenomenon that we experience here in the real world. In the world of mushishi, there also exist nature gods of Shintoism. These are ethereal beings of natural origin that are similar to mushi in that they affect the world around them, but they are more conscious and have more agency than mushi do, whereas mushi act more in terms of doing what they need to do to survive, without really any ability of empathy or really thought, and they don't understand how it affects the world around them. I highly recommend experiencing the world of Mushishi yourself. The show is artfully beautiful. Each episode has its own story and adventure, with some recurring characters, but mostly Ginkgo. And the character Ginkgo is very laid back. He's a very easygoing character, very easy to like, and he's very knowledgeable and intelligent, and just a well-written character. And nothing like what you'll see in like fighting and magic and monologue type anime. The music is also extremely relaxing and beautiful, and that's another thing about the anime that creates a world of mystery and like natural beauty. It's a calming show that also invites the watcher to look more closely and consider nature and the world around them in the real world. I highly recommend it. Yes, my dear child, monsters are real. I happen to have one hanging in my basement. The Monstermologist is a 4-book supernatural gothic horror series written by Rick Yancey. The first book, titled The Monstermologist, came out in 2009, and the final book, titled The Final Descent, came out in 2013, with 2 books in between, known as The Curse of the Wendigo and The Isle of Blood. It follows the lives of the protagonists, Will Henry, and his master and caretaker, Dr. Pellinor Warthrop. Will Henry is a young boy. In the first book, he is only 12 years old. And Dr. Warthrop, his age is unspecified, but he's likely in his mid-30s. And he has a profession in monstermology. Monstermology is a fictional concept in this book, in this series, and it is defined by this book as the study of life forms generally malevolent to humans and not recognized by science as actual organisms, specifically those considered products of myth and folklore. Think about like vampires, werewolves, that's that sort of thing. Or in folklore, think about like Medusa, stuff like that. Even though those characters aren't in any of these books, it's that type of stuff. And monstermology can also be described as the act of hunting such organisms. The organism that exists in the first book, what the first book is about, is something called the anthropophagus. And it is a large, tall, 8-foot, it doesn't have a head, it's cut off at the shoulders, but it has eyes in its shoulders, like here, and it has a large mouth in its stomach filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth. And its limbs are very muscular, and it's able to run and climb and jump very, very well. And the unique thing about these monsters is that in the book, Rick Yancey notes times they have been referenced in other literature, even by Shakespeare. Shakespeare used the word anthropophagus to describe headless beings with large mouths in their stomachs in one of his plays. I can't remember. I think it was Othello or something like that. So in this world, not only do these creatures exist in secrecy, but so does monstermology and monstermologists. They have an international society that holds conventions, speeches, and exhibits, and only those in the field of monstermology are invited to attend. They believe the secrecy of their profession is essential to the world, and that keeping such creatures and knowledge of the creatures out of the minds of the civilians so as not to cause undue panic or harm to the humans or creatures themselves. The books can also be considered historical fiction because they reference historical characters and events throughout the series. The first book takes place in 1888, and some characters that we know in the real world, such as real people or characters from literature that are hinted at as being real in the pages of the Monstermologist books. And some of these examples are Jack the Ripper, Charles Darwin, Dr. Van Helsing, and Arthur Conan Doyle. The series is also an example of metafiction, meaning that the books are meant to be considered not as a work of fiction, but as possibly a biography of a real person, that person being Will Henry. This adds a whole new dimension to the world of the monsterologist and links it directly to ours or yours, the reader. The way that Yancey does this is by taking a role in the story himself. He does this with the prologues and epilogues of each book, and they are told through the first-person perspective of Rick Yancey. And he plays an author just as himself. He plays as himself, and he receives notebooks and other documentation from a director of an old person home where Will Henry was and where he spent his final days. And this director contacted Rick Yancey to give him the notebooks in order to help him find some kind of real world relation to Will Henry, because he didn't have any family or known relatives or anything like that. So Rick Yancey then publishes the books, the Monsterologist series, as the notebooks that Will Henry wrote in order to try and introduce it to the public and see if anyone can relate to Will Henry or, contact Rick Yancey and be like, hey, I know this guy. I love that it adds like a real world kind of horror, like based on true events type thing. And if you're also a fan of that, if you're a fan of horror, great writing, great character writing, and odd supernatural creatures, these books are perfect for you. Imagine the world of Alice in Wonderland, but instead of Alice being a carefree child with a wild imagination, imagine her being the inadvertent cause of her parents being burned alive in a fire, and then being admitted to a mental institution where she is tortured ruthlessly by a crazed psychiatrist who is trying to induce a comatose-type mental state in order for her to get to withdraw back into this Wonderland state in her mind. What do you think of that? Everyone is familiar with the story of Alice in Wonderland, whether it's from Disney's 1951 animated cartoon movie, or Tim Burton's 2010 live-action films, or the books themselves written by Lewis Carroll in 1865. Regardless, it's a cute but odd story that has spawned an entire culture based on the adventures of a child in a strange land from her mind. But one adaptation is not cute in the slightest. In fact, it is downright dark, violent, horrific, and disturbing. It is a video game series created by the mind of a man named American McGee, and yes, that is his real name. And this version is so disturbing that it gave the games an M rating for mature, meaning they're rated 17 age plus. But that doesn't make them any less interesting. American McGee's first game came out in 2000, and a sequel came out in 2010 called Alice Madness Returns. It expands upon Carroll's original work and follows the same Alice character portrayed in those books. So, after Alice got back from Wonderland in those original stories, she was living like a normal life, and that's when the fire happened and everything since. McGee then sets her into the dark setting of Victorian-era London without holding back from the adult themes of the era. Alice suffers from PTSD, survival guilt, psychosis, and severe depression because of the events. This combination of mental illness, along with her new residence at an asylum, only amplifies the Wonderland in her mind. She then escapes to it in moments of solitude in order to help herself recover from her illness. Wonderland has also changed dramatically, just like Alice, and she must battle and puzzle her way through the dynamic lands in order to reach the depths of her own mind to help herself. Not only does McGee create his own version of Wonderland, but he also expands upon the real-world setting of Alice. She does spend time in the asylum and also outside of the asylum with a job of her own in order to keep her off the streets and the possibility of prostitution in the area. She interacts with her doctors and nurses and other patients, which creates a new dynamic to her reality and imagination. McGee also does a great job at fleshing out the different areas and characters of Wonderland that Alice originally encountered when she was a young girl and not a suicidal teenager. Even some of Alice's greatest companions, like Cheshire Cat, are no longer who she knew them to be. McGee creates a new role for each character and expertly applies them to how Alice portrays them in this new messed up Wonderland in her mind. For example, the walrus and the carpenter from the original story are now the showrunners of a burlesque play where instead of eating the oysters like they do in the original story, these oysters are now the stars of this burlesque play. Each setting of the game is also brilliantly fleshed out, giving it purpose and meaning in the world of Wonderland rather than complete randomness, such as the woods where Alice first encounters Cheshire Cat and the castle that the Queen of Hearts lives at. If you grew up with the story of Alice in Wonderland like I did, as an adult, you might enjoy this horrifying but captivating tale of American McGee's Alice. But be forewarned, this expansion of Wonderland and Alice herself is not for the faint of heart.